Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. So today's webinar will be towards a new Syria, sorry. So it's towards a new Syria, understanding the motivations and values of Syria's new rulers, which is being hosted by the XCEPT Research Program in conjunction with the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. So I'm Dr. Nafis Ahmed, the co-PI and Research and Policy Director of the XCEPT Research Project at King's College London. And over the last 12 months, my colleagues and I have been surveying and interviewing members of different rebel groups in Syria. This is as part of a larger body of research on the XCEPT project. So we wanted to find out what motivated individuals to join these groups, what motivated them to stay or to leave, and what values drive their decisions. Well, then in December last year, we watched as those same groups that we were studying overthrew the Assad regime and took control of Syria. Right now, it's impossible to predict what the future holds for Syria. The new leaders have promised to build a new Syria, but this isn't going to be easy. Over the last few days, we've seen a sign of what could happen if the issue of transitional justice isn't resolved and Syria's new rulers face challenges from across a number of fronts. And we're going to get into all that has happened in the last few days because there's been so much, even up until just a couple of hours before the webinar started today. So in today's webinar, we're excited to be able to share some of the findings from our research with you and give you an insight into what members of these rebel groups were thinking in the weeks and months surrounding the fall of the Assad regime and what they've been saying to us up until today, basically, because we've still been in touch with them. We're going to be discussing the practical and policy implications of our findings and how the international community can support a stable future for Syrians going forward. So joining me to speak about this topic, I'm delighted to introduce my colleagues who have been working with me on this research. Dr. Rahaf Al-Dougli is a lecturer in Middle East and North African Studies at Lancaster University, an award-winning scholar specializing in nationalism, sectarianism, gender, and political attitudes in authoritarian contexts. Niels Malik is a research fellow on the XCEPT project and ICSR. He is a behavioral scientist at the London School for Economics and Political Science. And Broderick MacDonald is a conflict researcher at the University of Oxford, an associate fellow at ICSR. For the first half of the webinar, my colleagues and I will present some of the findings from our research and discuss what these can tell us about Syria's new rulers. After this, we'll open up to a Q&A from the audience. You can submit your questions anytime during the event using the Q&A function on Zoom. So now finally, before I begin, I want to give you just a brief background on the XCEPT project. XCEPT, which stands for Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends Research Program, is a multi-year research program funded by UK International Development, which is exploring the cross-border dimensions of conflict and the drivers of violent and peaceful behavior. The XCEPT team at King's College is working to learn more about what drives people to engage in violent versus peaceful behavior, with the aim of supporting policymakers and practitioners to build a sustainable peace in conflict settings. If you want to find out more about the work we're doing as part of the XCEPT project, then please visit the ICSR and XCEPT websites and follow us on social media. I want to kick off by just giving you a quick background on the research we're carrying out in Syria. So, we are at KCL, a very multidisciplinary team. We have psychologists, social scientists, historians, clinicians. And as I said, the basic question is, what are the pathways to peace and violence? And we look at a variety of things. We look at trauma and mental health, gender, memory and conflict, trust in institutions, prisons, armed actors. So it's quite wide scoping. And we work with civilians, just understanding their point of view. Sometimes we talk to leaders, but we also have an armed actor strand of our work, as you can see there on the screen. And so this work was part of that armed actor strand. And there's a lot of armed actors who I guess you could say have been somewhat forgotten. People have put them on the back burner. They've seen the conflict, either they've seen them as just being defeated or marginalized or almost historical. So you can think about FARC in Colombia or Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, which some of our colleagues have been studying. Some of our collaborators on XCEPT have been studying those groups. And so one of those groups was, HTS and SNA, these Syrian rebels hanging out in the northwest of Syria and Idlib. You could say for many years, these were almost a forgotten group, at least in terms of the sort of international public consciousness. And so we were deciding, we have to study these people. They're still active, they're still there. And so we launched these psychometric survey studies and interviews. We collected more than 200 interviews and surveys with these individuals. We looked deep into their psychology. We asked about adverse childhood experiences. We asked about people had different levels of engagement. Some were totally disengaged, some were currently engaged. We asked about their motivations for why they joined, why they left. We understood a lot about their values and their identity. And of course, we were just doing this because we were studying, what motivates people to join armed groups, what motivates them to leave. Little did we know that this long forgotten group was going to essentially take over headlines again. So we were in this very fortunate position to have collected a couple hundred surveys and interviews with this group that had been forgotten and is certainly not forgotten today. And so we're very excited to talk to you about all of those findings and what those mean in terms of policy, practice, and so forth. So to kick off, to give you a little bit more detail about what we found more on the quantitative side, on the survey side of things, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Niels Malik.
Thank you, Nafis. I'll just quickly start sharing my screen. Seconds. Everyone can see that. Okay, thanks, Nafis, and thanks everyone for joining today. So I will be sharing some of the first findings from our research. But before we start, it's important to clarify that this is very much ongoing work. We collected, as Nafis has introduced, several hundreds of interviews in total, about 80 quantitative surveys, but we also very much look forward to continue the work on the ground and conduct more research on new research things and continue the work that we've been doing. To give you the scope of this work so far, I'll start by presenting this kind of overview of the main armed groups that were and largely are active in Syria. So of course there is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which dominated the headlines and was the lead group in the offensive that toppled Assad. It's also the group that the interim president al-Sharaa is from. There's Syrian National Army SNA factions. Many are backed by the Turkish government. There's Kurdish SDF forces. Then there's the Southern Operations Room itself, a group of different rebel organizations, which was also active in the offensive and actually reached the city of Damascus even before HTS did. But then there's also regime loyalists that are armed, and of course these have been in the headlines over the last few days because some fighting broke out. I think one of the other speakers, or maybe in the Q&A, we will delve more into that as well. And ISIS, even though it doesn't control much of a fixed territory inside Syria anymore, is definitely still active with cells as well. And so our data largely came from groups that fell under the Free Syrian Army FSA umbrella. So that meant a lot of those were from different SNA factions up here, but we also had some from HTS and other groups that were interviewed and surveyed. And all the participants have at some point been part of at least one of these groups. I say at least because there actually was a lot of movement and switching loyalties even between groups, even with different ideological leanings and so on. But all of them were active at some point. Some have then disengaged since, where others were still active to varying degrees. And of course, this may have additionally changed in the wake of the new developments in December and after that. And to understand these motivations of this dynamic of engaging and disengaging from the revolution, we started all interactions by asking the rebels themselves to rate how influential different factors were for their decision to engage or maybe disengage from the revolution. This list of options here is based on specific context knowledge of the Syrian context as well as from other contexts, but it's not an exhaustive list. But basically, rebels were asked to rate from 0 to 6 here the importance of different factors for these different decisions. And just looking at this descriptively, you can make out kind of 3 clusters of motivations, which I've penciled in here in red. The first one, extrinsic factors, by and large, did not play a decisive roles for most rebels. So these are things like outright material incentives, financial incentives, but also social connections and being advised by others to join and leave, for instance. Instead, moral factors were by far the strongest driver and motivation. So this is fighting perceived injustices in a sense. And often this meant specifically toppling Assad, which was the source of oppression and many of the injustices people experienced previously. And this moral outrage didn't just drive many people to first join the revolution, but crucially also for many to subsequently disengage from the revolution. And this especially was the case when rebels felt that their leaders lost their moral integrity, often because they were seen as having abandoned the cause and being unduly influenced by foreign governments such as Turkey, taking corrupt deals, that kind of thing. And then finally, the effectiveness of fighting also played a role in people's decision to somewhat. I'll briefly move on now to why these insights matter and some statistical findings to back them up. Now, I don't want to go into theory so much, but I think it helps to look at this for a few seconds. One traditional way from social psychology to understand why individuals are willing to make sometimes extreme personal sacrifices for collective political cause looks something like this. And the idea here is that people's social identity, the communities they're part of, their backgrounds and social environments shape how they perceive grievances, injustices, and also strengthens their sense of being effective whenever they band together and take action towards a collective goal. And so then all three of these factors are seen to lead to engagement, with social identity being kind of the driving force at the center of it all. But instead, our initial findings at least show a somewhat different picture. Identification with the revolution, as well as with specific groups, was very high, which I would say is kind of obvious when you're interviewing rebel fighters. But within this group of people that we interviewed and surveyed, identification did not predict higher willingness to fight and die, for example. Instead, the most dedicated fighters, which were those willing to give their lives or to take the lives of others for that political cause, were those with especially strong moral outrage against their primary enemy, which was Assad. And so this perceived injustice was the central driver for many. And addressing these injustices for many was even non-negotiable, something that Nafis will talk about more in a moment. And then efficacy also didn't have a direct association in a statistical sense. We're talking about average effects here, of course. It only mattered insofar as it allowed people to address these injustices in a more effective way. And so this dynamic made many, not all, but many rebels to something like aggrieved pragmatists, which were driven by moral goals very much, but then being pragmatic about how to get there. And so this is part of the explanation of why groups with otherwise vastly different visions, ideological backgrounds, and ideas were able to cooperate effectively in early December and were so successful in their offensive on Damascus. And we can learn lessons from these insights, as well as some other analytical findings that I haven't presented here, for what is happening since in Syria, now that the common enemy, which was kind of the main unifying factor in the revolution, has been removed from the equation, right? So first, it's important to state that there are still tensions between former rebel groups. I say former because many of them are actually now employed by the new government, of course. And old injustices haven't just disappeared. In fact, we know from many of the in-depth interviews that people also had like second or third order grievances beyond removing Assad against groups like HTS, against leaders like al-Sharaa, etc., or against other groups. And so one big question is, do some of these other grievances now come back to the fore and provide a factor for further instability or infighting? Another question that is somewhat unaddressed is how much there is for a desire for retribution against former regime loyalists. And again, this is something that has erupted in parts of Western Syria over the last few days. We will talk about more of that later. But then there are also challenges when it comes to foreign relations. As we've seen on one of the previous slides, many rebels actually develop moral outrage against their own leaders in their units and organizations. And this was often the case when they were seen as having taken bribes from the Turkish government or other foreign entities. And for many of them, that led to just disengage and leave the revolution or leave the group that they were associated with. But for others, it led to switching loyalties and following a different kind of group and political force. And there are also spoilers in Syria that try to exploit these frustrations, for example. On the other hand, these same dynamics could also provide more stability if they're understood correctly. So perhaps if the new leadership finds new values to coalesce around, as they did around the value of removing Assad, or if foreign actors understand and carefully manage the issue of maintaining leader integrity, that can be also a positive force for further stability and peace building in Syria. But I'll stop here and hand over back to Nafis, who will go more into these issues of foreign engagement as well, but more than happy to expand on any further findings in the Q&A later. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Niels. So yes, as Niels mentioned, I'm going to go a little bit more into the details of sort of what he was just discussing. And so let me just share these here for you. Okay, so I want to just kind of provide both a theoretical backdrop as well as sort of what that theoretical backdrop actually means in terms of potential policy engagement. So one way in which, we look at we look at fighters, we look at armed actors, we look at conflict is through what's called a rational actor lens, right? Which even if people are not consciously aware that they're doing it, oftentimes in policy circles or in just common parlance, people are in fact engaging in a rational actor analysis. What does that mean? It means there is oftentimes an assumption that the person that you're trying to engage with is somehow weighing costs and benefits, that they're looking at the material pros and cons of any particular decision, and based off of that calculation, they will make a decision. So this is the idea behind, if you want to dissuade people from joining armed groups, you use carrots and sticks. You offer them employment opportunities, you offer them threat of jail time, there's the danger of death. All of those things may dissuade or persuade someone to join a group or not. When you're dealing at the group level, at the leadership level, then there you might use things like sanctions, like foreign aid, other kinds of material, carrots and sticks that you can, if you're a foreign government, if you're part of the international community, you can maybe get those people to do what you want them to do. For example, form an inclusive, stable, democratic government by just offering the little incentive structures that you have, sanctions, foreign aid, trade deals, etc., to guide them towards a particular political end goal. Now, that works if that's the way those people think, if that's the way al-Sharaa thinks, if that's the way the leadership of Syria thinks, that's going to work perfectly fine. It won't work so fine if they are not rational actors, if they are something else that we call devoted actors. These are people who are motivated by sacred values. These are people who are, sacred values are values that are moral values that are of the utmost importance to people. They sort of transcend the material, if you will. People are willing to fight and die for these values. They're willing to give their lives and other people's lives for these values. And usually the core of an armed group are these people called devoted actors. And we can be talking about groups like HTS or SNA, but we can talk about revolutionaries, we can talk about freedom fighters. I mean, we can even talk about peaceful activists who are willing to give their lives even. So devoted actors are very different than rational actors because they're motivated by these sacred values. What makes it so difficult to negotiate with them is rational actors, you can use material costs and benefits and you'll be able to persuade them or dissuade them. When someone is a devoted actor and they hold sacred values, material incentives like sanctions and foreign aid and things like that are seen as profane. And they oftentimes lead to a backfire. People are offended and threatened when you offer them these kinds of material carrots and sticks. And so if you're dealing with a devoted actor who holds sacred values, then most of your standard conflict negotiation, mediation strategies will backfire because of the dynamics I just described. So this is very dangerous, and there are other ways to negotiate with devoted actors. So let's just dig into this a little bit into our data. Are they devoted actors or are they rational actors? So, we did all these surveys, and one thing we found was that 94% of Syrian rebels who we surveyed reported toppling Assad as their sacred value. So they have very different visions. All of these different groups, that Niels displayed on his slide, all those different groups, they have very different political visions and aspirations for Syria and for what they want for Syria. But what allowed their pragmatism to be able to ultimately win out was the fact that they all shared this one top sacred value, that we have to topple Assad. And so other values that are very important in terms of their political vision become secondary or tertiary values. And this is not only shown by their pragmatism, but it's also shown by the fact that even within the people that we interviewed, many of them had switched groups, which was very surprising to us. Some of them had switched from hardline jihadist groups to what you could better describe as nationalist groups, and then back again. And when we asked them questions about why they were switching, it was ultimately about who was the best, which group was the best on the battlefield against Assad. So that really shows that that was their top value more than other political considerations or aspirational considerations for the future of Syria. They had this shared value. As Niels described, they were not motivated that much by material benefits to leave or join the group. Now, what they did find, because we had people in our data sample who completely disengaged. These were people who had been, some of them became turncoats, and they even turned against their own group and started fighting in armed conflict with their old group. And some of them completely disengaged and said, listen, I don't even want to be a part of this conflict. I don't want to be a part of the fight anymore. And when we asked them, like, what was their motivation for their disengagement, the number one thing that came up was moral injury. And moral injury specifically from the perception of leaders losing their moral integrity. So moral injury is when you or your group or your leaders essentially are behaving in ways that violate your own moral values. So people, because it was sacred, because they were devoted actors to their fight, when they saw some of their leaders taking money from foreign powers and they perceived them as being bought out, from the sacred perspective, this was seen as, well, they're not devoted actors anymore. Now they're engaging in the profane. Now they're thinking like rational actors. Now they're engaging in instrumental thinking and thinking in a self-interested way. And that was incredibly deflating for the people, for some people who witnessed their leaders engage in that kind of behavior or perceived their leaders to be engaging in that kind of behavior, which caused them to defect essentially from the fight and to experience moral injury. So this creates a challenge now, because obviously that shared sacred value has now been accomplished. Assad has been toppled. So the new question, of course, becomes, well, what binds them all together now? What is a new shared sacred value that they can all get behind that can allow them to all these groups with all their varying political visions to essentially aspire towards a similar goal, knowing that their secondary and tertiary values may be quite different from each other. We hope that it's going to be some sort of desire for a inclusive, stable Syria, but we'll see if that's the case. This poses a variety of challenges. This analysis, what we know so far, poses a variety of challenges for the international community, because again, the international community's natural sort of first instinct is to use transactional carrots and sticks over sacred values. Everything from sanctions to foreign aid to trade deals to you name it. But as I said, this is a very risky strategy when it comes to sacred values, because if the leaders are perceived as being, in essence, strong-armed or engaging in too much transactional or instrumental trade deals and so forth, they will lose their moral integrity in the eyes of their followers. And if they lose their moral integrity, the cohesiveness, the glue that's holding these groups together can potentially fall apart. So what tools does the international community have? Well, they have symbolic concessions, and this can be everything from speeches to state visits to opening embassies, but it can also be more practical things like information sharing about a perceived, maybe like that there was an example not too long ago where there was going to be an ISIS terrorist attack where the US shared that information with the new leadership so that way they could thwart the attack. All of these things build goodwill, they build trust, they're they're increasing the credibility of the relationships. So that can have an influence. But of course, these things can potentially just be nice words and symbolic. They need to be followed up with actions. So while we said don't use transactional carrots and sticks, there's a series of material actions that can be undertaken by the international community. First of all, offer humanitarian aid to alleviate the suffering of civilians. It's the right thing to do, but it also helps stabilize the country. You're going to need billions of dollars or pounds or euros or whatever the currency is to help reconstruct Syria. But again, this needs to be done in an inclusive way where you have a variety of stakeholders and representatives of different communities who play a role, because otherwise you can potentially have something called competitive victimhood that arises. So this needs to be handled very carefully, but we'll need a lot of funds to go into that reconstruction. And economic aid is perfectly fine as long as it's being used to stabilize the country. So I just want to belabor this point. There's a difference between transactional material incentives that are meant to be able to leverage over sacred values versus economic aid that is not being used as leverage, that is not being used to acquiesce people, make people acquiesce over their sacred values, but simply to stabilize the country, which again will help with the cohesion of the different armed groups. And again, just beware of the disinformation environment. I understand that policymakers and diplomats privately can actually have very transactional conversations with leaders and say, we'll offer you this or we'll threaten you with that if you don't do A, B, and C. What's more concerning is less the private transactional conversations, but how those conversations are then being perceived publicly. Obviously, trust in institutions has been devastated over the years of civil war. People do not trust a variety of foreign governments. They do not trust mainstream media sources. They're oftentimes getting their information through alternative sources, including on social media. We are in a disinformation-rich environment that is actively being exploited by Russia, by Iran, by Assad loyalists, by ISIS, and so forth. So they are constantly trying to make the Syrian new leadership look like rational actors, look like they're engaging in transactional behavior, look like they have no moral integrity. And so what we encourage the international community is don't make their job any easier by engaging in some sort of these transactional offers privately and then going out publicly and saying that that's the material carrots and sticks that you're using, because foreign governments will be at the same time trying to affect relations in Syria and policy in Syria, but at the same time trying to advertise to their own constituents back at home all the moral grandstanding of what they're doing and how they're using their material incentives in order to push Syria in a particular direction. And while one can gain political points at home, oftentimes you're undermining your leadership in the country itself by engaging in that kind of behavior. Now to go into much more detail on current events, on things that are happening right now on the ground, on the difficulties that Syria is facing in terms of this cohesion project, I want to hand it on over to Rahaf.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Nafis, and thanks, Nils, and thanks everyone for attending this. I'm not gonna go a lot in the theoretical part of my research, but I want to start maybe perhaps with saying that over the last 3 years, I embarked on this research focusing on various armed groups within SNA factions, and specifically on using micro-level analysis of why fighters continue fighting and what kind of brings them into them moving from one faction to another, and how the regional dynamics, Turkish influence on SNA kind of impact fighters' motivations. All of this was pre-Assad fall. After actually, before in the pre-Assad fall era, I have noticed from my research that there are some alliances that's being shaped in previous to the latest offensive, the Red al-Udwan, which means that HTS has been strategically infiltrating SNA factions, specifically the larger groups. However, given that Syria is a war-torn conflict, and not only that we've seen after 2011, we've seen hundreds of emergence of hundreds of rival rebel groups, and all of these groups where there were many incidents of infightings and deep-seated grievances that among the biggest parts, the kind of the armed coalitions that dominate the Syrian geography. We have SNA factions in northern Syria, which are backed by Turkey, and we have HTSP4 in Idlib, and then we have also SDF in northeast and the southern factions, whether in Sueda and Dar'a. All of these questions regarding integrating or building a unified military or army poses the questions about not only how the integration process is managed, or how the Ministry of Defense negotiating this integration, which partially, as I discussed before in my reports, that were based on loyalty. It was loyalty-based appointments, and lots of there has been lots of lack of consideration of how fighters at the micro level feel about this integration, or the Ministry of Defense, or building a new military institutions. Another kind of challenges facing Syria is that I see that the new leadership is approaching the military integration in a security way, using a security approach, and not addressing or believing in the efficiency of having a parallel approach, which is a political approach, which needs that the Ministry of Defense needs to be representative, transparent in terms of its in the integration process, and also in terms of what's the position of the new leadership regarding the transitional justice file. Now, also beyond some of the also integrating all of these various armed factions poses certain political challenges, such as the security and stability, which remain critical concerns. I do want to say as well that we have noticed in the last, for example, yesterday we see that a sealed deal between SDF and al-Sharaa already is sealed. Most of this kind of deal is still vague and ambiguous in terms of what to be later discussed in terms of the integration of SDF fighters, and how the deep-seated grievances among SNA fighters and SDF will be managed. We hear lots of sentiments from Syrians in the last 2 days that, for example, certain leaders in SDF needs to get persecuted or held accountable for all the violences or atrocities committed in other areas in Syria. Also, sentiments among the Kurds in SDF controlled area also voice certain lack of trust in terms of this integration. All of these challenges poses certain approaches to be held by the Ministry of Defense, such as building a new or establishing a new military representative council, where the central commanders from SNA and SDF proposed that we need to have a military council that's representatives of all the factions that dominated Syria in the last 14 years. Having this military council will help mitigate the lack of trust we have. Also, there is a need for al-Sharaa to build a committee for transitional justice that kind of specify the certain how the categorization of certain crimes will be held or negotiated. There is, if we can move to the second slides, that one of the key questions that I want to address today in the 4 slides. Thank you, Clara, which is, what does it take to build a truly cohesive national army in post-conflict Syria? I think in terms of, if we go to the number 5, slide number 5, please, Clara. Thank you. So if we go to, if we have an idea of these different factions, we have the SNA composed of 40,000 fighters, we have the Syrian Democratic Forces, almost 70,000, and we have southern factions, and also HTS. It's important to mention that HTS, when it was dissolved, as announced by al-Sharaa on the 29th of January, we saw that HTS fighters were all spread over the security arenas in Syria. So they are now holding what's called Idarat al-Amn al-Am, or al-Amn al-Am in Syria. Now, in terms of the recent or like over just in the last 2 hours, we saw another announcement by al-Sharaa that the integration will be through the establishment of a representative military council. However, this means that there will be, I hope that there will be some looking over the last integration, which was based on loyalty. Some of these challenges that al-Sharaa, I think, internally had to decide on integrating certain factions like Abu Amsha, for example, and although like Abu Amsha is listed by the US for committing or violating human rights, for committing human rights abuses in Afrin and against the Kurds, however, he is still appointed in the Ministry of Defense. Even with this sealed deal between al-Sharaa and SDF, it's still awaiting for how the transitional justice process will be held, whether the new appointed leaders in the Ministry of Defense will be held accountable, and how this will be, and all of this actually not reaching a kind of a consensus, or not reaching a consensus on what the transitional justice will be regarding the central commanders in these groups, will in a way actually complicate the full integration and the build of a disciplined and unified national army. If we go to slide 7, I want also to highlight that one of the key challenges also the rise of sectarian tension. Syria, for the last 14 years, we have many political grievances that has been also expressed by many fighters. As Nils and Nafis has said, also my fieldwork and my interviews do highlight and do, like, my findings are very much similar to Nafis and Nils in terms of what compels these fighters to start fighting in the first place in 2011. The common enemy was overthrowing the regime. However, toppling Assad is not enough as a common aim or a sacred values for all of these fighters. Now we have the question of how these different or various armed factions that were so many incidents of infightings among them will they be able to build a unified national army? One of these key challenges is sectarianism and ethnic tensions and sectarian tension. Now, what we can know from, I think, the lack of the institutionalism in the Ministry of Defense pose a challenge for this full integration. Another aspect is how this security dimension will be also paralleled with a more of a complex and comprehensive political process. We have seen the national dialogue being held 2 weeks ago. However, no representation or no kind of discussions about transitional justice when it comes to warlords or atrocities committed in the last 14 years by these armed groups who are now part of the Syrian army. Now, these sectarian tensions or the sectarian violations, if not addressed, I think the Syrian National Army or the new army will be more of highlighting the factionalism and the complexity, the previous complexity that Syrians lived of the regional dynamics. Because till now, the SNA factions, up till last month, they were still receiving their salaries from Turkey. Now, with the upcoming sealed deals between SDF and al-Sharaa, we might see that some changes or containments, given that Turkey now has the prospects of containing SDF, there might be some systematic ways of how this integration will happen. Addressing these sectarian tensions or preventing any sectarian violations in the future is very much reliant and subject to how the integration will be held. If we go to slide 11, please. I want just to mention that some of the challenges that we saw in the last few days in Syria, especially in the coastal area, that we see most of these atrocities committed is because of the weak institutional oversight. Till now, because these different various armed factions are still not integrated fully in a systematic and an institutional way, we see absence of robust mechanisms to monitor and report abuses. Also, there is a fragmented command structure. So different armed factions still operate with relative autonomy, making it difficult to ensure compliance with leadership directives. And this is not only concerning SNA fighters, but also the foreign fighters within HTS from before. If we go to slide 11, now, I just want to also highlight in the last 2 minutes is about how the new leadership, one of these challenges also posing a kind of not going ahead with the full integration, is that there's so much reliance of the new leadership on external delegations or the external legitimacy. Internal legitimacy remains fragile, I think, due to the absence of a clear plans for accountability and transitional justice. Now, I think one of the striking challenges awaiting Syria now, given the last few days, is whether the current roadmap or announced roadmap for the investigative committee regarding the coastal incidents will address violation committed by whether the ex-regime followers or the opposition group. Will it be transparent and effective? Now, I think reasons for this ambiguity in accountability is al-Sharaa's challenges in holding the radical supporters within HTS. I think this needs to be addressed within al-Sharaa's close circle in terms of HTS. And also, we need to, the potential consequence of not addressing this is the deepening mistrust which will lead to deepening mistrust among local communities and particularly among victims' families, and will strengthen opposition narratives that would challenge the leadership, the legitimacy of the leadership. Now, I want to conclude with a question: whether can the new leadership overcome these challenges? I think there is a need to hold more of a focus and reliance on on an inclusive and a plural and representative political process that address the strategies to overcome the deep-seated sectarian divides within the Syrian societies, and we need to address the grievances of fighters within those various factions, and also we need to bridge the gap between the military governance and the civilian needs, which also might lead to allowing space for independent civil society initiatives to take hold and be part of how the integration will be processed, and also how the process of having a transitional justice file opened will be how to allow for a committee of a transitional justice committee in collaboration with civil society organization in order to hold accountable those who violated human rights. So there is a need to balance the humanitarian aid and distribution with governance priorities where the integration happens in a systematic, professional way, and to build a disciplined and unified army. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Rahaf. I'm going to take the last little bit of this webinar and really combine some of the theoretical insights that we heard about before with some examples of what we're seeing on the ground and show how those overlap, but also where we can go from here. So stand by. I'm going to share my screen. Unless, Clara, unless you have it up there. I'm getting an error message. Okay, bear with me here. I think we're having some technical issues on sharing, so I will start without slides and then I will come back in afterwards. I want to talk specifically about what's happened the last few days because it has been a whirlwind for anybody following this. Firstly, the situation for Syrian, I'm sorry, I'm not able to share that. Firstly, the situation right now has improved significantly just in the past 24 hours. We've seen this major agreement between the SDF and now between the central government. And then even this morning, we have seen another agreement either very close or completed between the central government and the South, the Druze and Sueda in particular. And so the question that we now have, I'm just going to see what is happening with the sharing. The question we now have is, where does Syria go from here? We have some stability. Clara, is there any chance you can put my slides up? Yeah, thank you. Great. So like I said, we've got both positive and negative factors affecting this. In the South, we have an agreement with the Druze and Sueda. In the East, we have this major landmark agreement with the SDF. And as Rahaf and my other panelists have mentioned, the details matter, but this is incredibly important and incredibly positive for the future of Syria. However, some of the fragility that our research exposed, and which Nafiz and Nils spoke about at the beginning, still shows through in much of what is going on. So in particular, I want to focus on some rogue factions within the SNA, particularly Amshat and Hamzat, which are two of the most brutal groups, even in the northwest of Syria. I remember doing field work back in 2023 and speaking to Syrian civilians who had dealt with these groups, and they were terrified of them. These groups act much more like warlords than rebels. And now that they've been included in this new central government, which is a very positive development, we still see that they have not abandoned their old tendencies. They still engage in some of the most brutal activity, and a lot of the violence on the coast that we saw last week was led by these two groups in particular. There were certainly others, but these two groups stand out in terms of the brutality and the extreme actions that they took. And it again speaks to the inherent fragility that al-Sharaa now has as he tries to rebuild Syria and put together some kind of a national military. Similarly, there is risks from foreign fighters and hardliners either within what was HTS, which is now the new government in Damascus, as well as foreign fighter groups that are closely aligned with HTS and have fought alongside it since Idlib. These hardliners oftentimes in other groups have been some of the more sectarian elements within them. They are often highly ideologically committed. And with that comes a certain level of extreme violence and a certain level of sectarianism usually. And certainly we heard from people on the coast that there were some, particularly Central Asians, that were engaging in some of these sectarian abuses alongside Amshat and Hamzat, which are not Salafi jihadis or even Islamists. Particularly, they're really a secular group. But nevertheless, there's some indications that these hardliners were not following the advice that was being given by the central government and al-Sharaa, which scrambled to really try and calm the violence as soon as it broke out, and then to warn any rogue unit that they would be arrested and imprisoned and brought to justice if they're engaging in these kind of human rights abuses. But as we see, both with Amshat and Hamzat, these more nationalist groups closer to Turkey, as well as some of the foreign fighters, particularly Central Asians, there's not always perfect alignment between what groups on the ground are doing and what the central government is ordering them to do. And this, again, speaks to some of our research and some of what we've written about previously. There's a real risk when outside groups, outside countries fund proxies. So for instance, Amshat and Hamzat receive a lot of their funding from Turkey. They're very close. We used to see them drive across the border. They've, of course, supported Turkey in other engagements in the region. And these kind of, proxy groups, which are, it's a complicated balance because they are Syrians or they're Turkmen, but they are still very close to Turkey, and in many cases operate much more like a proxy rather than a Syrian group fighting for Syrian goals. And so, again, to the research that we've conducted and the writing that we've done in the past, we really call for all outside actors to reduce or stop funding these proxies, because ultimately, if a group is pursuing the goals of a neighboring country or foreign country, that is, and they receive their funding, in many cases their salaries directly from that group, that is going to direct their interest towards the goals of that foreign country rather than the goals of Syria. And as we saw on the coast, that can be very, very dangerous when it means they are out of alignment with what the central government is calling for. Similarly, coercive trade deals. So, this could be selling off of national assets or the enrichment of particular political leaders, does a lot to undermine the credibility of these leaders amongst everybody, but in particular amongst hardliners and foreign fighters, those who are most attuned to it and those who are most able to take up arms and fight against what they see as corruption. So there's risks there. One unique piece that I want to mention, however, on the history of foreign fighters and hardliners, for that matter, within HTS or now the new central government. If we go back to the early days of the Syrian civil war, one thing that makes HTS quite unique is that they, unlike other groups similar to them, they refused to take some of the most extreme foreign fighters and the most extreme hardliners. They actually sent these to other groups, whether that was Daesh or to Jund al-Sunna or other smaller groups that had, a more extreme version. And so I think that some of those hardliners, either because they were recruited more selectively at the beginning of the conflict, or because they've been pushed out over the last several years as HTS has become more pragmatic, they will be less of a threat. But these foreign proxies, which are essentially funded by Turkey, this is a real risk in terms of the stability going forward. And in addition to all of this, we see constant disinformation, spoilers, and outside actors, whether that's outside actors from Lebanon, Hezbollah in particular, Israel in the south, Iran further east, or even Turkey in some ways can act as a spoiler, even though it may not ultimately seek to disrupt the Syrian revolution. There are counterproductive actions that they can take and have taken, which may do that. So we call for all of these countries to really engage. If we can go to the next slide, actually to the last slide, I'll just talk very briefly. Oh, sorry, the emerging U.S. response slide there, Clara. Yeah, great. So in terms of outside actors, we also see the U.S. sending very mixed signals, and the U.S. has a big role to play in this. Obviously, it is not just a economic power, but it also carries immense diplomatic weight. And so what it does now in the next few days and weeks really matters. We've seen, unfortunately, mixed signals from the Trump administration. Initially, Marco Rubio, in his confirmation hearings, spoke about the need to engage with Syria. In the last few days and weeks, particularly after some of the violence and revenge killings that we saw on the coast, there has been a sort of backpedaling from Rubio and by extension the U.S. But we want to emphasize here that this is a critical moment for Syria where it needs sanctions relief, which is a very positive way to support the rebuilding of Syria alongside humanitarian aid and non-coercive investments, because this doesn't undermine credibility. But if the US or other countries are going to remove sanctions, they need to engage and they need to start working closely with the new leadership, not just on intelligence sharing, but actually in terms of opening embassies, in terms of opening the lines of communication. And this isn't just the right thing to do for Syria to help them rebuild. This is also something that is in the interests of the United States or Europe, the EU, the UK, because we've already seen countries that are traditionally thought of as US adversaries, whether that be Russia, China, Iran, or others, start to try to slip back into Syria after, in many cases, in the Russian or Iranian case, having bombed Syria for 14 years. And this is not the future of engagement that we want to see in Syria. We don't want to see it revert back to what it was. And we also believe that from the US or the European perspective, there's also a national security interest in engaging with the new leadership. As this new SDF deal has been formed, we know that there will be joint patrols between the SDF and the central government in terms of keeping IS on its back foot, securing the camps in eastern Syria. And so all of these reasons, whether it's keeping adversaries at bay, or whether it's securing the rebuilding of Syria so that there is reduced violence or no further rounds of political conflict in the future, or simply keeping the IS threat under control, all of these speak to the need for urgent engagement, not just by the US, but by the European Union. And we're starting to see some early signs of this. The EU has lifted some sanctions, the UK has lifted some sanctions, and al-Sharaa is now being invited to Brussels just next week to engage in a major donor conference. These are really positive signs, and I think the European Union can kind of lead the way on them. But we need ultimately the US to engage. And without that, this will only go so far, will only be partially successful. I'll leave it there and look forward to more discussion in the Q&A right after.
Thanks very much, Brody. And we'll get everyone back on screen if possible. Rahaf and Brody back. So thanks, everyone. I see we already got some questions coming in. There's obviously a lot to discuss. I'm going to tie in the first question from Elena, which is, her question is, what are the rebels' plans towards the camps in northeast Syria, such as Al-Hol and Al-Rouj? But obviously, I want to frame that question in terms of the SDF agreement that's just been made, because obviously that's going to change everything. What is your take on this? This was very surprising to me. I think it's probably surprising to many people. I think from a lot of people's perspective, we've been talking about the common enemy, and at least part of the common enemy picture for many weeks there was the threat of the SDF towards the new leadership. But now there seems to be this agreement that's in place. What does this tell us about, I guess, both internally, these groups? Are they truly pragmatists? Is al-Sharaa pragmatist? Is the SDF more pragmatic than we actually thought they were? Is there something that we're missing here? And the devil's going to be in the details of what's to come in terms of the actual practical implementation of this agreement. But also maybe what does it say about external actors, the role of Turkey, the role of the United States behind the scenes of coming to this agreement. So if you could maybe address some of those broader questions about this agreement that's just been made, and then also maybe just touch upon the future of Al-Hol and Al-Rouj as well.
Was it addressed to me, Nafis, or
whoever wants to take it? Go ahead.
Okay, I can take it. I think it's a great kind of, even if it's symbolically, it's a lot of progress, and I think both al-Sharaa and al-Sharaa in particular, he capitalized on this revolutionary spirit. And I think given in the last few days that there has been that kind of incidents and violations in the coastal area, it was very much essential for them to draw this deal, even if it's symbolic, and it's giving them 9 months to go through the unagreed conditions that both parties have. In terms of the integration, I think that will take some time, but at least the military confrontations, as before our interlocutors were confirming that there's no kind of direct military confrontation. And let's not forget that the PKK also, negotiations with Turkey has also pressured SDF, and with the precarious situation of the US approach towards SDF, all of these kind of conditions, I think, pressured SDF to at least hold or pause any military kind of confrontation between SNA or the factions that are in northern Syria. I think for the time being, this means unity and at least kind of hinder some of the external intervention in Syria, at least containing Turkey. But in the long run, I think there is lots of challenges, as I've just mentioned. The deep-seated grievances among Arabs and Kurds needs to be addressed in an inclusive political kind of process, and not only kind of focusing and getting fixated on the security approach.
Great, thank you, Raf, for that. I just want to encourage everyone again, if you want to ask questions, please, you have a quick Q&A button there on the Zoom, so please throw in your questions. I'm going to skip around a little bit in the order of the questions, just because I think this is somewhat related, because we were talking about this sort of common enemy element. So what is Israel's role in this development, and how is it intertwined with the position of the Trump administration? Who wants to take that? Brody, I think you're probably well suited to maybe engage with that question.
Sure, I'm happy to chat a little bit about that. And actually, I'll bring in the last question to that as well, because I think what we've seen the last few weeks, and part of what has helped to keep the new central government stable and together, was that there was these outside threats, whether that be Israel and its actions in the south, whether that be Hezbollah and trying to infiltrate the border on the west, or spoilers from Iran or Iraq or elsewhere. There's been a whole host of outside threats. And even within Syria, the unconfirmed, undecided question of what happens to eastern Syria and the SDF was an internal mechanism that was keeping those factions in Damascus very closely together. They had, many common enemies and many common goals that they needed to achieve. What's remarkable now is that we have seen just in the last, 24, 48 hours, finally some kind of a solution with the SDF. Now, I know the details of exactly what this looked like, on the ground in practice matter, but it's a huge pressure release, to have that question at least partially resolved. Similarly, if the southern factions, have signed some kind of an agreement that is lasting with the central government, that will make it more difficult for Israel to position itself as a defender of the Druze. And then similarly, the violence on the coast was tragic and brutal, but HTS or the central government now that it leads, has signaled that it is taking this very seriously and is putting a plan in place to do a better job of managing that and really pushing for transitional justice. It's appointed a committee, and we need to see exactly how that committee works. But whether you look to the east or the west or even the south of the country, you see a lot of these shared threats and shared goals that were helping to keep the central government so compact and so cohesive have now been resolved. And so, speaking to some of what Rahaf and what Nils got into, I think now the real challenge for Syria is to unite around a new shared objective. This isn't a military objective. It's not about keeping eastern Syria engaged, not about fending off attacks from other countries. It's now about how you build a inclusive, unified Syria going forward. And that is a challenge, because these groups do have different interests, as we've talked about in some of our research. They have different priorities, they have different backgrounds, different interests. But I think that the real measure now will be how much al-Sharaa and the new government can unify the country around not just shared enemies, but shared common goals for the future of Syria.
Thanks, Brody. I want to pivot to, I guess, one of the questions which gets at the role of al-Sharaa as an individual, as a person. The question is Sharaa still seen as a credible moral leader, or is he seen as selling out to gain power? ISIL has made much of his Felipe Petek watch. This is a question that we all of us have talked about quite a lot, which is the mystery of al-Sharaa as an individual person, right? Is he himself a devoted actor with strong sacred values and a clear moral vision? Is he a wolf in is he a wolf in sheep's clothing? Is he a true pragmatist? Has he stepped into this new role as a statesman? Is it sincere? And also, I'm going to add to that, not just who is he, but also the way in which I think many different people, different groups, different factions probably imagine who he is, their vision of who he is. If you're SDF, if you're SNA, if you're HTS, if you're one of these subgroups, who you think al-Sharaa is probably varied. And everyone probably thinks there's the real al-Sharaa. There's the guy we see and hear him talk, and then there's the real person underneath it. And who people perceive as the real person is varied depending on who you are, what group you're aligned with. So I just wanted to open that up to whoever wants to take that. Who is al-Sharaa? What is his credibility? Who is he?
I'm keen to get on this, but I don't know if Nils wants to go. Okay,
No, I'll leave it to you, Rahaf. Go ahead.
Okay, I think this is one of the most difficult questions facing academics and Syrians as well, and I do find like the mixed kind of the complex of my positionality coming in. Like part of me emotionally wants to believe that he is gonna lead the next phase of Syria in an inclusive, plural, and maybe, if I may say, democratic, which he's been very, very shy not to mention it. In terms of discourse, he is still using an emotional narratives when he is addressing Syrians, but more of a pragmatic. And I do hate the translation when it's done. So when Ahmed al-Sharaa is talking to any Western media, the translation, the English, does not actually highlight the emotionalized and the primordial narrative of al-Sharaa, which is essential. So even though English translation gives some of the practical and political terms, but when you understand it in Arabic, still it lacks the legal terminology or the correct political terminologies. So I have not seen till now a very comprehensive political speech or rhetoric by al-Sharaa. However, from my interviews, even among those rivals, old foes of al-Sharaa, they kind of confessed the role of charismatism of al-Sharaa. And this is something perhaps has helped al-Sharaa in sidelining. Of course, let's not forget that the part of al-Sharaa's strategies in the past was sidelining, marginalizing groups. Some of them were killed, targeted, or imprisoned. But at the same time, I think he is keen on capitalizing or hinging on this charismatism to bridge these gaps. Now, the second thing that I want to focus on beyond whether he is genuine or this shift is genuine or not, I think still he is faced by so many challenges to prove his genuinity. Part of that is his internal groups, the internal rivalry within his group as before, and also some of the challenges or some of the fighters' imaginations of the new Syria is built on fighting al-Sharaa himself, because there are so many deep-seated grievances from before the fall of Assad. And so it's still awaiting the time for when the national narrative can be built in a way that accepts al-Sharaa maybe not only as a president of Syria, but someone who is capable of leading or opening accountability and the transitional justice file. All of this needs lots of complicated process and lots of negotiations in terms of politics, and also let's not forget the regional dynamics. I think one of the mistakes now al-Sharaa is making is not quite playing on regional on the complexity of the regional dynamics. He needs Syria in its transitional phase, in that precarious nature, we need an ally, unlike when we think of sovereignty, when we have a stabilized Syria. So I think there is a need to rethink the regional approach, and also how al-Sharaa would be able to navigate all of these challenges in terms of the internal military structure of these groups. But let's not forget one of the cohesion. Everyone confessed that HTS is cohesive because of its charismatic leader. And I think Turkey played a lot of infiltrating or sidelining any charismatic leader within SNA. And I have so many examples like Abu Ahmed Noor and many other central commanders that were sidelined because they are charismatic. Anyway, I will leave it for later.
Yeah. Let me just add one point to that, because I fully agree, but also because Rahaf specifically mentioned the charisma, but then also taking it back to the original question, which also said this incident of al-Sharaa being seen with expensive watches, and there have also been other moments that have been quite sensitive in their reception in media, within Syria and media as well, like social media and local outlets, with al-Sharaa meeting foreign ministers from Germany and other, going to these international meetings now. And so all of these things, in theory, could be potential kind of breaking points where people feel that there is some selling out going on, and there is some sort of normalization and engagement with partners that may not be sympathetic to the cause from the perspective of some hardliners, perhaps. But I think we have to conclude now that 3 months in, 2 to 3 months in, this hasn't happened so far. There seems to be sufficient goodwill from the rank and file members, from the hierarchies below al-Sharaa and these other groups, to at least wait it out and give him a chance to build this coalition. As Raf was pointing out, many challenges are left to be addressed. And there probably will be some moments of also having him making tough decisions, and then we'll see how that plays out with the rank and file members. But so far, I think we have to conclude that people haven't felt this kind of selling out that often has taken place with SNA local commanders' relations to Turkey, etc.
Can I just come in on that for 1 second? I want to add to a little bit of what Rahaf and Nils said before we go to the next one. This is fundamentally a question of charismatic authority, right? This is Max Weber all over again. And I think what we've seen with Sharaa is that he has some degree of charismatic authority. Now, as social scientists, political scientists, we hate to study this because leaders and personalities are very hard to measure, and it's subjective and normative, but if we look at the reception that Sharaa has gotten, whether it's on the coast, even when he went to visit it, whether he's also gone to the east of the country, he's gone to the south of the country, wherever he's gone, we've seen protests in support of him. As well, if you look online at Arabic language, Syrian Facebook or Twitter or Telegram, you see widespread support and excitement from people who are not part of HTS before, who are outside of the HTS fold. And so I do think that he has some degree of charismatic authority, which has helped him to keep this coalition together so far. With the caveats that we mentioned, there's still, some rogue SNA groups like Amshad and Hamzat, which are not towing the line of the central government and are, committing abuses. And then, of course, some hardliners, Ahmed al-Mansour, of course, have gone off and, tried to start other kinds of regional issues, let's say. But besides these, these kind of figures, we have seen Sharaa show that he has some degree of charismatic authority. Yes, things like the Patek Philippe watch can undermine that, and that's potentially a problem. I think even more though is some of the coercive trade deals, if they were to happen, or personally enriching beyond sort of a watch given by MBS, things like that. I think more substantive policy decisions can actually undermine. And we saw some foreign fighters just yesterday criticize the new central government for signing an agreement with the SDF, which they regard as an enemy. So I think that, yes, these kind of material things can undermine it, but policy, particularly bigger policy issues, matters even more. And despite all of this, we are seeing, a really unique phenomena where charismatic authority is playing a role in keeping this together. And we don't know how long that will go for, or how deep that, charismatic authority is. Part of it could be euphoria driven by, the freedom of being rid of Assad after 14 years. But I think there is something to it. And it's something that I think all of us on our team are going to look at more in the future, because despite the challenges of studying it, it's certainly a factor at play here.
Definitely, I agree on the last one. We don't know for how long this charismatism will work for al-Sharaa. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that last one. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think sort of relatedly, one of the last questions that just came in, and I'm going to broaden it out a little bit, but the question is, given the relative instability within this loose arrangement of former rebel groups, how does al-Sharaa prevent groups under his nominative command from carrying out revenge killings or systematic oppression of the Alawi amid some reporting of atrocities? Personally, very optimistic, but recent days are potentially warning signs. I'm going to open this up, but I also want to, what it seems to me when I see everything that's going on, obviously there's the role of outside influence and spoilers and so forth, trying to create instability as much, foment these tensions, foment these points of fragility to try to create wedge issues or conflicts in order to break apart this coalition. That part to me seems more obvious. But what the reaction to it is what sort of surprised me as well, at least amongst not the central government, but at least some of these smaller factions, which is this wellspring of a desire for revenge is what to me was also on display as much as outside influence. People still want justice. There was immense injustice, as Niels has highlighted, not only just over the course of the Syrian civil war, but we're going back decades, pent up, historical, collective memory, intergenerational sense of injustice. And this to me seems like this thing that's looming in the future, this transitional justice issue. I feel that people are going to give Sharaa a little bit of space to do what he needs to do to create some stability. People are tired, they're exhausted, they just want electricity, they want food, they want water, they want some degree of stability. But that appetite for justice is still very much there, and it's going to pop back up again. And if it's not done in a way that really makes people justice can be very subjective. And if it doesn't give people a feeling of justice, then this could be a real point of contention and fragility within this network. So I just want to hear what different what anybody who wants to jump in if you want to talk about this issue.
Yeah, I will come on this very briefly. I think following what SNA in terms of building a fighter, the moral teachings that a fighter has been subject to be part of that armed factions, that we need to look at these moral teachings carried on in SNA. My interviews in Damascus with some of those officials responsible to update and revise the curriculum for the new soldiers now in the army is quite essential, because I've been asking these questions about how you can, in terms of like these fighters have been fighting with different armed factions for 14 years. How can you now put them in one army, believing in one also national sentiments, believing in the sovereignty of Syria? I think part of addressing the sectarian tension and how al-Sharaa can prevent these groups from committing these atrocities is actually bringing or consolidate a kind of teaching for all of these fighters or soldiers in the new army that facilitate the kind of dialogue among them about sectarian tension and also silm al-ahli, the social cohesion, building peace. And I think there has been one thing that I found a little bit concerning for me is that there is more of reliance from these professionals within the Ministry of Defense to focus on religion as a tool to mitigate any sectarian tension. I'm not sure if religion it can be used as a way to perhaps educate or teach or highlight that sectarian tension should not be happening by any of these security forces or the army. They are relying on this. However, I think still, even if that's carried on in the Ministry of Defense to mitigate any sectarian tension or sectarian grievances in the future, still accountability and the judicial rule is that needs to be held for, or needs to take an initiative to be part of holding accountable all of these violators of especially in the last 3 days. So I think there is a challenge for al-Sharaa now to change the Ministry of Justice, Madhar al-Wisi, who is known to violate, to commit crimes. And so that people will have trust in the judicial institution or in the legislation institutions, and will have also trust in the investigation committee. I think so. There are two approaches. The Ministry of Defense has the responsibility to build a narrative, a national narrative of unity. And also the transitional justice file and how it will be processed.
I agree with all of that. I'm going to add 3 quick points on this idea of transitional justice, but also speaking to the question how you keep this loose arrangement, particularly those groups we mentioned that are at risk of not towing the central government line, not following it entirely. Firstly, the transitional justice needs to happen both at the community level, but also within the new MOD and the new military, because those are actually the units that will have their hands on weapons, that will be patrolling, that will be governing in many cases the actual regions. And so there's a real risk there. Secondly, I had a conversation with a colleague about this in Oxford last week. I think there is a risk that there is a repeat in some cases, not as extreme, but there is a risk that the central government goes too far in de-Baathification. We, of course, saw what happened with the US when it did this in Iraq in 2003. And I think we do need to recognize that there's a lot of Alawis, people on the coast who had nothing to do with the regime, or they were conscripted, and they were not serving on their own volition. And in many cases, these communities may lack jobs or economic opportunities. And so the government also needs to think about employment for them. And then the last piece of it that can, I think, help to both reduce some of these tensions, but also keep the influence of those rogue or less disciplined groups that we spoke about before in line, is also expanding the recruitment now of new members into HTS. I've spoken with friends who've been there in the last few weeks. In many cities, there's still a shortage of law enforcement, police officers, even traffic police on the ground. Now, the group has grown significantly in the last few months. They started recruiting almost the second day of the offensive. And I've talked to people who sort of best estimate this at about 30,000 new members have now joined the central government over the last few weeks. So that helps to dilute some of the influence of those hardliners and foreign fighters, firstly, but also those groups that act more like proxies, like Amshad and Hamzat. So to the extent that the new government can expand recruitment from Syrians who maybe did not have a history with an armed group before, these are Syrians who want to serve their community, work in law enforcement, work on the ground, making a real difference, and they don't bring some of that baggage. To the extent that the new government can recruit those people now, it's going to improve security on the ground, but it's also going to dilute the influence that those more problematic units that are still within the original structure will have in the future of Syria.
I think I will add just one thing for 1 minute. Partly, I think al-Sharaa and the Ministry of Defense learned from their mistakes. I think they will not open again the popular mobilization as they did in the last 3 days ago, or like few days ago, when they opened the mobilization and called for people to hold arms and to go to the coast. I think this is what kind of instigated more or contributed to more violence and atrocities in the coastal areas. So they need to address that open mobilization of people should not happen again. And I think I want just to highlight one thing, which is an article that will come out soon about fighters, Syrian fighters fighting in Africa, deployed by Turkey. Till now, even after the fall of Assad, their fate is still kind of on pause. No one even communicated with them to return from Africa. So we still have Syrian fighters fighting in North Africa under SNA before, and we still have more than 14 big groups in SNA still has not fully integrated, and the central commanders were not appointed or agreed on certain appointments proposed by al-Sharaa. So we need that still lots of challenges to unify all of these various groups.
We started a few minutes late, so I'm allowing us to go a few minutes over. But I want to kind of end things on a bit of a provocative question. Someone here asked about, how can XCEPT's research on sacred values and devoted actors be taken into practical account for policy recommendations? I've written a lot about this over the years. You can go to XCEPT's website. You can see some stuff that I've written on devoted actors. We talk about everything of how to use symbolic concessions, acknowledgements, tragic trade-offs versus taboo trade-offs, how to counter-engage and not just counter-message, how to leverage social norms. So I highly recommend you go to the website to see some of the I mean, this has been my life's work, so you can see a lot of my writing on there on the topic. But the one thing that I want to pose to my colleagues here is one of the biggest things that we see historically across different groups is after you win a conflict, you take over, there will always be these remnants of people who are part of your old enemy, your old foe. And if you make them feel socially excluded and persecute them or whatever, this can potentially be a very long-term problem for you. They can turn into insurgent groups, they can turn into terrorist groups, they can be turned to proxy groups by foreign influence. So I guess the question is there any way we can see some of these regime loyalists themselves potentially finding integration into a new Syria? Is there a way in which they can be somehow part of a new Syria and a power structure? And if so, how long will that take? How much justice what sort of justice needs to be doled out in the interim to make people feel like that they have that appetite for those people? What do we do with them? Because if we don't find a place for them in the new Syria, this could potentially be a very long-term problem. So I'm curious to hear if anybody has any thoughts about that.
Yeah, happy to just quickly start and kick it off. I mean, as you say, Nafis, this is kind of a problem that all kind of successful, at least insurgents face, right? So like and then there's also the complication, I guess, that this group of people has kind of fallen from power. So I think there's kind of probably a habituation process going on of like finding a new role in society overall, because even though demographically they have been in a minority for a while, obviously the power asymmetry was strong as long as Assad was ruling the country, and they've been involved in all these institutions. I do think to some degree, I would argue that the offer for integration has to come a little bit from the new government, because they are now the state institutions, so they need to build institutions that allow for some form of participation. But that's obviously easier said than done. I probably am happy to hear other thoughts, but probably I wouldn't see a way for them to be integrated into a joint military, for example, where they would have to be, serving in the military alongside people that were fighting against them beforehand. But perhaps there are other ways of extending the inclusiveness of a new government to those demographics as well. But happy to hear Brody, Rahaf, other ideas.
Okay, so I think there are some mirroring of Iraq mistakes, and some mirroring. I'm not saying everything, but there are some echoes of Iraq's mistake of de-Baathification. I think And part of my also briefing to them in terms of my research with the new leadership, when I was being even told about the laying off of these employees before even the announcement of it, I think the challenge for the new government, not that they want to exclude Alawites in particular, but there is more than 400,000 state employees that are ghost employees. And because of that, because like mostly the privileged ones were Alawites, so they got affected. There is no chance economically to reinstate these employees, which I am against, as Nafis mentioned, and Nils, that this will contribute to lots of spoilers and how this will be manipulated. But I think al-Sharaa kind of saw that there is a problem of laying off all of ex-regime officers within the army. So there has been some announcement 2 weeks ago to reinstate some of them, only those technical, because of the lack of command, the lack of institutional capacity to actually lead the state. So al-Sharaa found himself that he needs some of these ex-regime officers and get them back. And I think that the recent events in coastal areas, it was also transformational for al-Sharaa to get convinced that he needs to do power sharing and he needs to collaborate with other political factions, not in terms of military, but also those who are different from him in terms of political ideology. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahaf. Thanks for everyone for joining us today. We're going to have to wrap up now. I'm literally being kicked out of the room. So please follow us on social media, on X, on LinkedIn, and go to our webpage and see all the various things that we're putting out across different conflicts around the world, and check out our foreign affairs piece that all four of us co-wrote together, and stay tuned for more research. Thank you again, everyone. Bye-bye.